This is the Performance People podcast with me, Georgie.
And me, Ben. This pod is all about people who know about performance.
We're going to speak to some of the biggest performers in sport, entertainment, business and politics about how they got there and how they stay there.
And we'll talk to those closest to them about all the stuff we didn't already know about them.
You can listen to Performance People in the usual places where you get your podcasts or watch us on YouTube. And don't forget, you can always follow us on our Performance People channels.
For now, though, here's our latest episode.
Joining us on Performance People today are a brother and sister combo who've had the most interesting of professional and life journeys, separately and together.
Fran Millar spent most of her life working in cycling as a manager for British cyclists and then in lead roles at Team Sky, which then became the Ineos Grenadiers. Last year, Fran left the world of cycling to take the CEO role at top British fashion brand Belstaff.
Alongside Fran is her brother David Millar, who is winner of 10 Grand Tour stages over a 21-year cycling career. He's now perhaps best known as a campaigner for clean sport, having served a 2-year doping ban in 2004.
And this is the first time that Fran and David have been interviewed together, so we're claiming a world exclusive.
We are.
I didn't do Team Sky because I loved cycling and I was passionate about cycling. I got into Team Sky because I was passionate about what happened to David not happening to somebody else.
When I came into the sport, it was a fundamentally doping culture. Absolutely to the bone, and had been for 100 years, basically.
David, Fran, I'm so excited to chat to both of you. I mean, for one of the reasons that we've just established that you guys haven't actually spoken together before in an interview situation. So this is a rare and a privileged scenario. So thank you for doing this chat. I wanted to start and take you right back to the beginning because you have a shared experience through life because you're brother and sister. So you've come up together through cycling and you've ruled that world supremely well. But what about the early stages? What about the beginning formative years of your childhood? Sort of just take me back. Maybe, Fran, let's start with you as the little sister. Take me back to sort of life as a couple of youngsters.
We basically grew up, my dad was in the RAF. So David was born in Malta, then I was born in the north of Scotland, and we grew up in the north of Scotland until we were kind of, sort of 5 and 7, or sort of 4 and 6, I think, and then moved down to High Wycombe, we were sort of pretty tight as young kids, I think, but then my parents got divorced when we were 10 and 12, and David went to live in Hong Kong with my dad, so we got split up. So I think that's probably been the thing that's galvanised our relationship massively, because we spent such a long time of our formative years separated from each other. It meant sort of the time that we did have together, we really made the most of it.
From my side, when we were young, I think France is right. We were pretty tight, I think, from the travelling around as well, but we're such polar opposites in personalities in many ways. There's a lot of similarities, but I was quite quiet as a kid, and France was the outgoing kind of sort of social one. And so I'd lean on Francis a lot to kind of carry situations. And that was even as a kid. And that's pre kind of adolescence.
Were you closer when, David, you came back to living in the UK? How did that, you go through those years, keeping in touch and developing that relationship?
I don't think we did. I think I sort of disappeared to Hong Kong and just was quite selfish in that respect. And it was before kind of the mobile internet. Write a fax letter back to mum occasionally when I was forced to. And then we essentially for many years crossed in the air. And it was, in hindsight, it's really sad what happened. But as Fran said, it was, it ended up kind of certainly galvanizing us, that's a good word. Because I think once we almost missed that adolescent sort of separation, where you start to kind of rebel against each other, because we almost started our relationship in our late teens properly, which was really interesting. So we didn't really know each other, and it was extreme sides, so we'd only see each other briefly, and it would be quite intense moments, either Francis and me in Hong Kong hanging out with my friends, and in the UK, I was just getting into my cycling, so I would just do that. So we lived very different lives in our adolescence.
So my recollection is a bit different. I remember that he did stay in touch. My dad used to always send me postcards from wherever he had gone, because my dad was an airline pilot. So my dad would send me postcards, and I'd occasionally get like what I now look back on and consider probably trolling, before trolling was a thing. Postcards from David like, "We're in this amazing hotel. They've got gold taps. See you later." that kind of stuff. So I'd get a lot of that. I felt like I got at least 2 or 3 of those every few months. And then we would speak on the phone as well. And then my recollection is he would come home to the UK. Obviously, he'd be riding, and we would watch the tour for the little bit of time that we had together. We'd watch, it was in the Indurain era, we'd watch the tour, and we'd watch loads and loads of Fraser that my mum had recorded for him on VHS. So, we'd sit together and watch Fraser and watch the tour. And I remember being super excited about seeing him going to see him in Hong Kong. I don't really remember seeing David in Hong Kong much. I just remember seeing my dad. So my recollections of him in my adolescence are very much from our time at my mum's house in Maidenhead, and kind of just watching the TV and him going out and training, and it feeling very, like special time to hang out together, because we probably only got a couple of weeks a year to do that.
So, and Fran, were you into sports as much as David, or was it because of David's sort of love of cycling that you got into that, and then sports?
I massively rode his coattails, Ben. I didn't like sport at all, and was like, "Ooh, that looks exciting and interesting. How can I get into it? I'll follow David." I was weirdly though. I wasn't sporty. I went to a very, very small musical theatre school in Maidenhead, which had kind of been my emotional blackmail of my mum, where it's like, well, if you're going to get divorced and make David and I live separately, I want to choose the school that I get to go to. And bizarrely, she went for it.
Good bargaining power.
I know, right? I look back and I'm like, wow, that was Machiavellian. So I ended up at this incredible tiny little school, and I would do dance, but I was, I started at 13 and I was kind of doing good toes, naughty toes, and my friends were all on point, so it was a bit of an embarrassing experience. And then I left school, didn't want to go to university. Went to London, got my first job working as a PA for a very successful guy in sports management. And as soon as David won the yellow jersey, the sort of guy I was working for was like, "You're a god-awful PA, but I think you'd probably be quite good as a sports manager. Why don't you go and manage your brother and I'll help you?" And I was like 20, 21 then. So that's what I did.
Fantastic. What an opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So with cycling, how did that sort of manifest itself with you, David? Because you're in Hong Kong, and you're between Hong Kong and Maidenhead. So you're sort of, are you looking for something? Are you searching for something that you needed in your life that was sort of, your thing that you could do, that you could get good at? And what was it that drew you to cycling in the first place?
I was pretty sporty from a young age, but I didn't like school. I didn't enjoy school. And sport was my escape. And it was from BMXing to skating to, when I got to Hong Kong, it was the wakeboarding and mountain biking. And I just loved these sports. They tended to be kind of loner sports and outside of the school curriculum. And cycling, because I was fortunate to be in the 1980s. I mean, I was looking, Ben and I, there's only 1 month between us. So we are literally kind of the same generation, Gen X, pure. And so I experienced the 1980s BMX boom and then the mountain bike boom. And I was just going into whatever was cool at the time. And kind of, there were new kind of crazy sports, same with wakeboarding. And and that led me oddly to hanging out with some older guys, expat guys in Hong Kong who mountain biked, but who came from road cycling. And they saw me on a mountain bike and they were like, "You should try road cycling." And it was the last thing in the world I'd ever considered, because there was nothing in our family. That's usually the trajectory. It's a father, an older sibling, or a sibling. But for me, road cycling was a completely foreign sport. And all I saw was this archaic sort of spandex, shaven-legged, weirdo sort of environment. But they started to brainwash me. They gave me videos of the Tour de France. They told me stories. They gave me magazines, books. And I fell in love with the Tour de France in Hong Kong. And that's when I was going back and it was on Channel 4, and that's when France and I started to watch it, sort of early 90s, like 92. And I ended up selling my mountain bike and buying a road bike. And that then became my kind of the only sport I was truly passionate about. And because, like you were saying, it seemed such a romantic and rebellious sport to get into, because nobody I knew did it. There was no culture of fame or money, because I think at that point we'd only had 3 British riders who had ever spent any time in the yellow jersey. Actually, only 2, I think, at that point, because it was before Chris Boardman got his in '94. So it wasn't a sport that had any great kind of history for British athletes. And all of that attracted me to it. And so that's why I got into it, because it was the ultimate rebellion, oddly.
It's interesting that you say a loner sport as well, and the sort of characters that are attracted to it. I think there's a real similarity with you. We were talking about this before, but with you and Ben in that regard, because certainly for you, I don't know if it's the same for you, David, but for you, Ben, you can tell us better than I can, but is it about that sort of form of escapism, these types of sport? It's sort of this very much you and the bike, or you and the boat, sort of almost against the rest of the world. It's sort of, you can block out everything else and just focus on being really amazing at one thing. Is it that?
Well,
there's sort of this...
Maybe. I mean, there are some of these sports where you can disappear from hour on end, like cycling and sailing, and and for sure, there's definitely some kind of escapism in that at a young age. Maybe if there's some other issues going on that everyone's sort of different as they're growing up, aren't they? Going through different challenges. But yeah, I mean, I certainly loved sailing when I started out, sailing in a single-handed boat, just going away, getting away, having control, no one really telling you what to do. And I'm sure it's the same on a bike. Well, it is the same on a bike. But I mean, thing that I'm sort of fascinated in David is, having been in Hong Kong and then getting into road biking, and then, seeing the opportunity. Well, it's interesting that there weren't, like you say, there weren't really that many Brits really performing at that level. How on earth did you
break
try
through?
Yeah, exactly, or find that support mechanism to get you from that dream to actually it being a reality? That must have been an amazing experience to come through.
Yeah, I think it was a double-edged sword in a way, because the fact that there hadn't been any success, and the culture at the time was that it was nigh on impossible for a young British rider to go across the continent and succeed, it meant there was nothing to lose. There was no kind of precedent. And that was, in many ways, that meant there was no burden on my shoulders. There was no risk of failure, because everybody failed. And so when I got back, and I was like, I'm going to go and do this. And I thrived off, I guess, this kind of Hong Kong mentality. I'd lived in Hong Kong in the early 1990s where, anything was possible. There was such an energy. And getting back to the UK in 95 and everyone telling me, no, you're too young. It's impossible. You won't be able to do it. And I was like, well, how do they do it? They're kind of, there's young guys over there doing it. And so I had a couple of people around me who supported me, a guy called Mike Taylor and the sadly passed away Paul Sherwin, who kind of backed me and got me a club when I was 18 in France. And I went across there and got my head kicked in for 2 weeks and genuinely thought I'd made a terrible mistake. They were right. And I went to a phone box and called up Mike Taylor, and he said, hang in there another week. And I hung in another week and won a race. And then it kind of, the floodgates opened. But it was, I think I loved the idea, and it was probably the same for Ben as well. When you're told something isn't possible, that's like putting a kind of a red kind of flag in front of me. I'm going for that. And that's what I was like when I was 18, 19. It was kind of, and I think that's part of what drives a lot of people.
And so, Fran, at that time, so David's now in France, and at that time, you're sort of witnessing what's going on with him sort of starting out in that professional sense over in France. And so what was your relationship like then? Because as you said, it sort of grew through your adolescent years.
Weirdly, I don't remember that bit very much. I remember kind of the bit beforehand when my mum would take him to random lay-bys on A roads, and he'd race time trials for Hoboken Cycling Club, and I'd be like, this is the weirdest sport in the world. Or he'd like come home in his full lycra, having trained, and like not be able to get the key in the door because he was like bonking, and I'd be like, what are you choosing to do, you freak? So I remember that bit, but I don't remember him actually kind of, I sort of remember him having a metro, and my mum saying to him he had to like do some stack some shelves at Tesco's to earn enough money to go off to France, and so I don't really remember having much contact with him while he was in France. I remember it being really tough. Like I think my mum was quite worried about him, and weirdly actually my mum very rarely tidies out her house, but she was tidying out her house recently, and she found his like diaries from when he was in France, and it was so cute. Like he had like can of baked beans 20 cents or whatever, and it was like, and he'd written it all out. So he had the money that he'd been given by the Rayner Fund, which is like a British charity that was set up after a family lost their son tragically in an accident in a nightclub. And he had been a very promising cyclist, and they funded David for his first 2 years, David, or first year?
First year.
And so he had his Rainer Fund money, and he'd like keep all of that detail. So I don't really remember it. I just remember being like excited for him, and he got things like free Oakleys, and he sort of, people were excited, and he was in Cycling Weekly all the time. So it kind of felt like in my little world, it felt like a really big deal, and like my brother was doing this really weird but kind of cool because it was weird thing. But I don't really remember much about our relationship other than just obviously being very proud of him and taking the mickey out of him relentlessly.
Well, it's interesting though, going through those diaries and keeping those notes on expenses and everything. I mean, Dave, did you feel already at that stage quite an intense pressure to make it count? The Rainer Fund had come in and supported you. You had a lot of other people helping you, obviously, to get there. Do you feel like you couldn't let them down and you needed to really make it count?
I put so much internal pressure on me, and I guess that's what France was saying regards the worrying as well, because I was on my own kind of for a year in France, for 8 months, and it was, there was a phone box outside. I was in a house where the random French riders would turn up and occasionally like steal stuff, and there was we're going to the supermarket in the afternoon to kind of walk around eating a chocolate baguette was the highlight of the kind of day, kind of something to do, because I was in this northern village in Picardy. I was learning French somehow, and because I obviously didn't speak a word of the language when I got there, and so there was, and I look back on it and it was tough, but I'm grateful I was of that generation, because if I was there now in the same situation, I'd probably be scrolling Instagram, kind of watching Netflix, whereas I was keeping accounts in a book, I was reading books, I was kind of learning the language, and so it was tough, but it was formative to the nth degree, and I'm quite sad for the modern generation. They don't have to go through those. I say this in parentheses, like hardships, because they're hugely beneficial.
In terms of that lifestyle, that's a lonely life, isn't it? That's a lonely. You're sort of on a career ascendancy, but it's a lonely life to be living. It doesn't feel that fulfilling from a personal perspective, but obviously it's starting to really ramp up from a professional perspective at that time for you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was. I kind of made my own bed. I was saying before, and probably like Ben as well, I chose the sport because I was a loner. I always say it's the paradoxical thing. And actually, I'm just thinking out loud, not speaking out loud. The paradoxical thing for a cyclist is you start it as a loner. It's not a team sport. And you fly through the ranks, and you're making your own destiny. Then when you get to the very highest level, World Tour, it is the most team sport in the world. And so it means you've got these bunch of loner individuals who are then kind of have to learn how to work as a team and be on the road together. And then you have that contrast of often you finish the race, you're flying out there back to your kind of lonely existence a lot of the time when you're young. Back then anyway, not so much now. But I think it was tough, and I think it's probably what brought France and I closer together, because I came from Hong Kong, so I didn't really have my home to go back to. So in my off-season, I'd then try and fit a year's worth of socialising into about a month and a half. And
quite successfully on occasion.
Wild.
Yeah, it was. Well, I mean, because I was like Little Miss Sensible. I didn't really like drinking. I never liked being out of control. I was always worried about David because he was so extreme in everything that he did. So when he was at home, I was always like panicking that he would, when he was at home in his off season, panicking that he'd, I don't know, be found face down in his own vomit somewhere or whatever. And he never, every time we took him anywhere, it was never cool enough. He didn't like the music. He didn't like the bar. It was like, we have to go to the next place. We have to go to the next place. We have to go to the next place. And I was just like, oh my God, this is just the most awful of evenings. And it used to, all my mates who I still hang out with now, who Davis has been on holiday with, who we've now known for like 25 years. We've become a very tight group of friends. But at the time, everyone was like, wow, your brother is a high maintenance. And it was a lot. I had to find the coolest bars and the coolest restaurants and the coolest people, and none of my friends were ever cool enough. And I was just like, oh, okay, whatever. Bizarrely, I went along with it though, which I don't really understand looking back.
Yeah. But this piece about, going from individual sport to team sport, I mean, I can totally relate to that, from a sort of an Olympic background, and then getting into races like the America's Cup, which like tour cycling is the ultimate team sport. But you both got great experience of this from slightly different angles. But I mean, starting with you, David, how did you go through that process? And looking back, did you think there was enough support to help you to become a team player? I mean, I certainly know from my own perspective in sport, perhaps there wasn't enough, or certainly looking back in my own, I didn't identify that early enough. But do you feel like there was a support? And Fran, I know you've played a major part of that with Team Sky and the other teams that you've been involved with.
I think for me that I had a career of two halves, literally split in the middle by my doping ban. And in that first half, I kind of look back on that with regret, the fact I was quite a prima donna, and I'd had no opportunity to learn how to lead. I kind of came in guns blazing, and by the time I was 23, I was basically leading. Well, I was leading France's #1 cycling team at the Tour de France, and throughout the season, and was their highest paid rider, and the French treated me as French, and I didn't manage that well. I literally was a prima donna now in hindsight, and I was probably one of the worst people to interview. I think within the team on the road I was good, but I don't know if I was so much afterwards. And when I had that ban of 2 years and got to really kind of change as a human and come back with a lot more humility, I was a much better leader, and I became an owner of a team. I was still a winner, still a leader outright, but I actually began to relish the role of what we call the road captain, which is where you're managing the team on the road and off the bike and everywhere. But that took me kind of a decade to learn how to do that. No one showed me. You'd see some of the riders do some good things and take that. But I relished the role towards the end of my career. And so while I was doing that, Francis was at the other end of the extreme, doing it, learning how to do it in a different environment, and I think building what became the team which has changed the shape of the sport. But we were doing it in two very different. Francis was leading a whole team on and off the bike, and I was learning how to do it on the bike in the races. And so it was really interesting how we had these parallel trajectories, and literally the other side of the barriers in a way.
And during that time, did you both talk about it with each other, the sort of successes and the failures of each of your stances and your approaches on it? Bearing in mind, David, you were coming from one place, and Fran, you were coming from another. Did you have those sort of conversations about what was working and what wasn't working, and share those experiences? Or did you just keep telling David off for being a prima donna?
Do you know what? It was actually really difficult because David had been one of the riders that Brailsford had identified as potentially coming on to Team Sky. Before it was Team Sky, it was just this idea of a team that he and I had been working on for about a year. And he kind of identified David and been a bit like, I wonder how Sky will respond, or who a potential sponsor will respond to having an ex-doper. And Jeremy Darroch, the CEO of Sky at the time, was pretty adamant that he didn't, irrespective of how much David had changed and how much, he'd kind of gone through and how much a change he'd actually brought into the sport. Jeremy was adamant at that time that he wanted to kind of have a completely clean slate for Team Sky. So if we were going to do a team with Sky and they were going to fund us, he wanted to take a different approach. And Brailsford sort of came up with this concept of zero tolerance, which was, in hindsight, and I think Dave B has spoken about it as well. It was a very naive, potentially, approach, which was this idea that if you had served a ban for doping, you couldn't ride on our team. But at the point at which that decision was made, David was one of the very few athletes who had confessed to doping and served a ban. Most people get caught, or they deny it for a really, really long time, and then they, through weird whispers and insinuations, they eventually get found out. So it was this quite stark decision that we made, and we ended up, signing a whole group of people who had potentially quite questionable backgrounds, but because they hadn't served a ban for doping, they could work for the team. So David and I had quite a fractious period of our relationship, not actually between each other, but it was the first time in our lives where we'd had to say, right, we need to compartmentalize our relationship as brother and sister and our relationship on the road. And so we were brilliant mates. We still, I always used to go to the Garmin bus because it was the most fun bus on the tour, and hang out with him and his mates. we used to talk about all sorts of stuff, but we kind of drew a line on, we don't talk about performance, we don't talk about decisions that are being made, within our team and within his team. We created a bit of a Chinese wall on it.
To say, Fran, how did you support David through that? I mean, it must have been, David, such a stressful period that you went through with the ultimately with the ban. And how did you both cope with that?
I think what was interesting, Ben, is that, as Fran said, and it's amazing how you forget some things. I forgot how fractious it had become between Francis and I for a phase then. I mean, really, and publicly as well.
I'd be always in
attacking,
freaking in magazines being like, zero tolerance is a shit policy. I don't know why they came up with it. And I was like, you know why we came up with it, because I fucking told you. That was basically it for about 3 years.
Yeah, it was. And we had to it got to the point where it's like, right, we have to draw this line, because it was actually starting to kind of hurt our relationship. But the thing was, France had been the most, and always been the most supportive person for me. I mean, she's my absolute port in the storm, and always has been, always will be. And I'd been living on her sofa and brought a lot of heat into her life. And for a long period of time, always have done. But there were some really hot periods. And I think part of that fractious period came because during the ban, Frances stood by me. I'd lived on her sofa. I'd affected her relationships. She'd supported me through thick and thin when I was getting attacked, like left, right, and centre. And then I came out of it, and I mean, Lance Armstrong called me Saint David. I kind of came out of it and was working with the World Anti-Doping Agency, with international federations, kind of helped build the kind of team, the 100% clean team, with Team Garmin, Team Slipstream. And I was very vocal, which was part of my mandate. And so I took that to the extreme, where I thought, well, I'd be lying if I wasn't vocal about my sister's team, because that would be kind of, that's how this sort of thing happens. If I start to do that, then that's basically the omerta again. But it did get to the point where it was like I had to kind of basically rip up my own rule book and say, you know what, I'm not going to talk about Team Sky. I'm not going to talk about Bradley Wiggins. But it took a lot of me talking about them to get to the point where it was like Francis saying to me, David, you stop talking about it now, because otherwise this is just going to ruin our relationship. And it was fair enough, because I think I got to the point where my message had got across.
But Fran, that must be equally hard for you as well, because on one side you've got Dave B saying this is our policy, and Jeremy Darrett, this is the Sky approach. And then on the other side you've got your brother who's gone through this huge redemption piece. And you know, the stories that you can tell as a result of having been in the eye of that storm, David, and what you've learnt from it and what you can apply to, you know, the next bunch of generation of people coming through. I mean, there's so many massive learnings there. So that must have been hugely frustrating time for you, because you can absolutely see why it would be of value for them to have someone like David in that setup.
Yeah, I mean, it is at like sort of face value, yes. And I think I originally for me, it's probably the biggest leadership lesson I learned in my life. And it guides me even now, because it was at a personal level, I would have loved David to have been part of the team. And at a personal and professional level, I believe that David had something to offer the team that was unique and different to anyone else in the sport at that point in time. However, I also fundamentally believe that the sport needed to change. And I fundamentally believe that change needed to be systemic, and it needed to be from the top. And it needed to be done in a way that created real conflict in some ways. And that's what we did. You know, it was a controversial policy. Was it the right policy? No, I don't think it was. But was it right for that point in time? Yes, because it forced conversations that weren't happening. It forced, the grey area of, okay, well, if we think they've been doping, but they've never been caught, but there's all this rumour. What does that mean? And the conversations that was forcing behind the scenes in Team Sky, in the sport, in UCI, in the ASO, you know, people weren't party to that, but I was. And I was party to the decisions that Team Sky were making were changing the face of the sport. And my values, so from a leadership perspective, my values, I didn't get into this. I didn't do Team Sky because I loved cycling and I was passionate about cycling. I got into Team Sky because I was passionate about what happened to David not happening to somebody else. And that decision was like, if we make compromises at this stage in the game, at the very inception of the team, that could potentially compromise my ability to do that. And so my own values enabled me to say, you know what, I believe that this team is going to have a way bigger impact on the sport than me fighting for David to be a part of it. And so being able to live by my own values and do that was really important to me. And then the challenge I then faced was, further down the line in Team Sky, finding out some of the, decisions that had been made that I wasn't party to, that I wouldn't necessarily have agreed with, and everything else. That then became a real conflict in my own head of like, wow, what is this now, and what do I stand for, and how does that all fit together? But at the time, and now, if I could turn back time and change the decisions, I wouldn't. I still think that the decisions that Team Sky were making were the right decisions for the sport, and they were very aligned to my values. And being able to watch Geraint Thomas win the Tour de France in 2018 and have my hand on my heart, I would put my hand in a fire for that guy. I know that he's clean. I know he won the Tour clean, and I know that he probably would have struggled to do that in any other team. And if the sport had continued the way it was continuing prior to teams like Slipstream and Team Sky coming on board.
One of the things that I saw you talk about was that moment with Geraint Thomas where Fran was in a photo with him when he'd won the Tour, and you said what she did with him, she was unable to do with me. And I thought that was hugely evocative and emotive to talk about it in that way. And that must have given you a huge sense of pride in what she had achieved with Geraint, but also some feelings of regret, I guess, because like you say, it very much could have been you.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me a bit emotional just thinking about it now. But I think that was what Francis doesn't talk about there, because I did it when I came back after my ban. My biggest drive was this shouldn't have happened to me. And my motivation for putting so much work into the anti-doping movements and spending years on commissions and putting myself on the line in the media was by I knew that I could prevent it happening to younger riders if I educated people and if I put myself on the line and I actually went and worked with commissions who'd never spoken to a doper before. And so that was my mission, and I think it worked, and it took years. But with Frances, it was the same. She was doing it for one person. She was doing it for me, in the sense that she knew. Well, it makes me a little sad. But, yeah. So yeah, it's that was a very moving moment. Yeah.
The one thing we didn't brief on this, David, was we weren't going to cry. I was going to say the one thing I was like, we had a little brief chat, and I was like, didn't brief the whole, don't cry, let's not cry.
So it must be so raw.
It will always be raw. I mean, it was a brutal, and it remains a brutal part of our lives. It was kind of, and it was so public. Even just hearing David talk about it and me talking about it, it's like we both played these very. I mean, I was behind the scenes. My team was a very public role player in the changing of the sport. David was this absolutely front and centre of changing the sport, and his team Slipstream were absolutely part of the change as well. But it meant that we had to take these very different and opposing positions, and just everything that we went through together as a family, as David and I, as teams in the sport. Yeah, it was brutal. But at the end of the day, we as brother and sister, we went through a really, really brutal time together for a long, long time. And I think it kind of, you sort of forget the emotion of that and how much that pulls you together when you go through something. Because for so many people, it's this like really simple binary thing, like, oh, well, he cheated and he got banned. What's the big deal? And you kind of, you sort of sit there and you think the ignorance and the naivety of that, and in the sort of the culture that he had gone into as a kid, and the environment that he was placed in, and the decisions that he was being asked to make at 19, 20, 21 years old to say no to doping, and that kind of slow erosion of your own values and your slow erosion of your own, personality and character. It's like all of that stuff that I was just like, that I'm not going to let that happen. But it's built on a place of quite significant trauma, to be honest.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Before we move on, because it's such a key topic in sport, what's both of your take on where sport is currently at, and sports like cycling? And I'm really fortunate coming from a sport where doping isn't that prevalent. There've been a few cases of it in sailing or professional sailing, but very few. Ultimately, I guess because the sort of risk rewards aren't there. But it's clearly still prevalent in sport. And, what, in terms of the deterrence, I mean, are they, this sort of zero tolerance or not? I'd put my hand up. I'd always been a zero tolerance kind of person, but certainly reading up on your story, David, I have to say it certainly opened my mind to it a little bit more than perhaps where I'd been previously. But where do you think sport's at now, and do you think the deterrents are high enough, and if what changes could be made if they should be made?
Can I take that one first, David? Because David can speak far more eloquently about rules and regulations, and his work with WADA and everything else. My fundamental belief is where there are humans, there will be cheats, and that's just the nature of life. But I also fundamentally believe that a bit like burglary, or when people doing other bad things, that fundamentally it's not about the deterrent. It's about creating the culture that stops people wanting to make that choice or feeling they have to make that choice. And I believe that in every walk of life. I believe that if you work in a bank and the culture that you're in is that it's about being ethical and honest, that's what that people at the very top are building that framework and building that culture. That is the greatest deterrent. It's the hardest. It takes the most time. It takes the most effort. It's paved with pitfalls and things that go wrong and people that don't want to live by the values. And as we saw in Team Sky, it's not bulletproof, but it is, in my belief, the only way that sport and humanity changes is if you decide, right, culturally, this is the framework we're going to create. These are the values we're going to live by. This is how we're going to support and encourage people to do things the right way. And that I don't believe deterrents stop anyone doing anything. Otherwise, we wouldn't have crime, because you can go to prison. Do you see what I mean? So that's my belief. And I've been a part of seeing what an amazing culture can really do, and it's what I'm trying to do here with Belstaff. It's like create a place where people feel psychologically safe, and if they get presented with things that they feel are outside of the ethical code of both their own lives and the life of the business they're in, that they feel safe to raise their hand and say, I don't believe in this. So that's my feeling about it. But David, I think, will probably have a far more eloquent response around actual anti-doping.
No, I think you're 100% right regards, and I agree with the deterrence. That was something I always fought for. Was I didn't believe in the lifetime ban, not in first offence, because I think that again goes down to the culture of any environment. If there is no second chance, there's no forgiveness, there's no learning, and the human condition must allow for forgiveness. I think it's built into us. I'm not religious per se, but it's the very essence of Christianity is forgiveness, and that doesn't mean that it's without punishment or penance. That is also part of the duty of the culture you're within. The punishment has to involve rehabilitation and learning. And it's through that rehabilitation and learning that you prevent those mistakes happening in the future. And so for that reason, I think what we've seen, and to go back to your initial question, Ben, regards that, I have seen since I turned pro in 1997 to now, my final year is 2014, and I've been watching it close up with headphones on, talking about it ever since as a commentator, that I saw when I came into the sport, it was a fundamentally doping culture, absolutely to the bone, and had been for 100 years, basically. It was part of the sport. And deterrents were put in. There were more and more controls were put in. There were contracts signed by riders saying, if I dope, I will be fired immediately and pay back my salary. None of those things made a difference. What made a difference was over time, kind of building in the biological passports, the whereabouts system, the top-down responsibility from team bosses and sponsors to actually go and be proactive to the riders and members of their team and say, we do not believe in this. That had never happened before. Blind eyes were turned and heads were put in the sand. And that was when I came back in 2006, part of my mission. And I knew, and I said it, if we go back there and look at the things I was saying at conference, I said it's going to take a decade. And to kind of actually for the sport to fundamentally kind of change its culture to an anti-doping culture. Now, most of the young riders that are out there now in 22 they're winning the biggest, and I always say the biggest races are being won by clean riders. And I think it's interesting to see now that there's been this paradigm shift. And there's 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds winning the biggest bike races in the world. That's a full cultural shift. And that was something that would have been considered absolutely impossible like 15 years ago. because you came into the sport and you were told it's going to take you 3 or 4 or 5 years to mature. And what they were basically saying was until you get to the point where you'll start doping. And then, so there was this mindset. So I think what's happened now, it's a beautiful sport. And I'd happily, I mean, perhaps not happily, if my children wanted to get into professional cycling, I'd feel absolutely convinced and safe that they would not encounter needles. They wouldn't encounter doping. I mean, I was the one that brought in the no needle policy into all sport, into the WADA code, because I believe that injections should not be used unless it's for medical emergencies. They shouldn't be used for amino acids or glucose or for vitamins. Injections should never be near any athlete. And I brought that code in, and that's another story. It took me quite a bit of work to get them to pass that one through. But yeah, so I genuinely believe now that this sport is in a good place. I believe that young riders have the opportunity to exploit their physiological and psychological prowess at a young age, which wasn't possible before.
Why dope at all when you were winning simultaneously when you weren't doping, if you see what I mean? That's the bit I don't get, because you obviously were winning and you were having success, and then the doping was sort of obviously coming into the fore at various other times. But why go there when you knew you could win without it?
It was considered in the late 90s, early 2000s, impossible to win the Tour de France clean. That was just the fact within the peloton. It was that was part of the omerta. And I wanted to win the Tour de France. That was my kind of goal. And that's what everyone believed I was capable of doing. But in my weird kind of justification, I wanted to win races clean. And then I could go, look, if I can do that clean, I've definitely got a chance of doing this if I don't. And so I would win Tour de France stages, I would win Vuelta stages clean and other races, but then it would be a gateway to going, okay, this is realistic. It's if I can do that and beat these guys doping, I should commit to this because I want to do this. And it was acceptable because we had the doping culture and it was a rite of passage. But yeah, it's very hard to explain that to people because I could win time trials, I could win road races, I could win stage races clean. But if I wanted to win the Tour de France, I was going to have to learn how to dope. And so it's as I say, simple as that. That was my
I also remember
process.
though, David, you saying to me sort of when you were on your ban that one of the big things that kept coming back from from Cofidis, which was David's team at the time, was this idea that he's not a proper professional until he dopes. You're not a proper. You're kind of playing at it, David. And it was this idea that when he crashed in 2001 at the Tour de France prologue, they were like, right, David, you've been kind of playing at this long enough now. You have to come and dope. Like this isn't good enough. We can't have this amateur behaviour anymore. And I remember you telling me that story, and I was like, wow, that is wild. That it was like it wasn't you've crashed and and you've won a few of these races, and it's great that you're winning these races clean. It was you could be doing so much more, and it's really disrespectful of you that we're paying you all this money and you're refusing to dope, and now you're crashing in the bike race. Like you need to get your act together. And it was that to me, to a 23, 24-year-old, what were you, 24, 25-year-old at the time, it's like,
24.
How on earth can that be the conversation that your superiors in a team are having with you? And it's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, there was some serious grooming going on, and I think they knew that the talent they had a huge physical talent in me, but they also knew that perhaps psychologically I wasn't as strong as I kind of had been. Well, they wore me down to the point where when I was in a weak position at Tour de France and had to stop on the 10th stage, they basically said it's time. It's kind of time to kind of grow up, and as Francis said.
Incredible you say it's the Omerta, the club. Till you did it, you weren't actually part of the gang, really. It's amazing. But David, you got to take a huge amount of pride in, like you say, where the sport's got to now, and being a big part of that. It's certainly you converted me. Just in this chat, you guys have converted me from the zero tolerance. You get banged to rights and you're out to there has to be a better pathway than that, and I think creating that culture.
Well, thank you,
absolutely
Ben.
right.
Yeah.
Good on you.
And what about what happens next? Because you two, Fran, you're now, riding high on the crest of a huge wave with Belstaff and CEO of that. So what are the big lessons learned from everything from the Team Sky Winning Behaviours days, which, by the way, I think is the best job title that ever was, Director of Winning Behaviours, fabulous. And how do you apply that? How do you apply sport to big business? Because that's where you're at right now. I mean, David, you're doing it with your line as well. So how do you sort of apply that to a business brand like Belstaff?
That, to be honest, that was the appeal of Belstaff. It wasn't actually so much the coming into fashion, because I've never really had any particular interest in fashion. It was the idea. I've been in Team Sky for 12 years. I'd worked for Brailsford for most of my adult life. Actually, I've been in and around Dave, and I've learned so much. And I really wanted the opportunity to see if I could take all of that knowledge and lessons and learning and the stuff I've learned from Steve Peters and how do you build a winning team and apply it somewhere else. It's the bit of my job that I absolutely love. It's building. One of the first things I did was I created like a whole mission, and I got everyone branded sweatshirts. And I was like, I don't know how to do this other than doing it like we're a sports team. So you're all just going to have to come on that journey. And they're all on that journey, and we're in a really good place. And it's it's got the same challenges. I've got young people coming into their first job. How do you stop them burning out? How do you make them feel they're part of something? How do you give them the right development pathway? How do you make sure that they are accountable and taking ownership? And, it's all the same things, just in a completely different space. So I absolutely love it. And actually I think that's the bit that I'm passionate about. I think I've discovered coming here that the thing I love, the reason I love Team Sky, the reason I love doing the Eliud Kipchoge Challenge, the reason I love doing this is I love working in an environment where I can help people fulfill their potential. That's the thing I'm good at. It's the thing I enjoy. It's the thing I'm passionate about. It's what I get out of bed for in the morning. So yeah, it's been great to come and do it. I absolutely love it here. But I absolutely love it most places I go. So I'm like, I've never really done anything that I've not loved, because I don't think I'd be very good at it if I went somewhere and did something I didn't love. So I think just developing that learning and continuing to hopefully learn more about how to help people get the best out of themselves, really.
Do you find, Fran, coming from sort of intense sport, and obviously the riders and everyone involved are so hugely motivated and the work ethic is just huge, coming into business, do you find the same work ethic, or do you sometimes find that because you're not waking up each day to try and go and win the Tour de France or whatever, that people sort of strolling in at 9 o'clock?
Do you know what?
And walking out the door at 5. Is that something that's a challenge, or?
It's a great question, Ben, because exactly. No, it's a great question, because I think that the biggest challenge that I've faced here is that you forget when you're in a professional sports team, particularly at like your level and at the level I was at with Team Sky, the majority of people who are on that team are at the very top of their game. They've done everything. They've been there. They've got, they're either right at the beginning of their career, but they're the best talent in their, country, or they've been a mechanic for 15, 20 years, and they're the best in the world at it. So that idea of like pushing yourself and striving for excellence and marginal gains and all of those things, that's a much easier thing to work with a group of people who are at their top of their game. Whereas when you come into a business, there are people who, quite frankly, they just want to pay the bills. They want to go home at 5 o'clock and see their kids. They're not here to be the best in the world at what they do. They're here to get paid. And trying to get to change the culture to make people feel like, being part of something is really special, and you spend more time in your work than you do any other part of your life. So actually, if you can make it something that has purpose and focus and determination and ambition and strive to be better, then you'll get more out of it. That's kind of the approach I've taken. But yeah, for sure, it's a totally different mindset that's needed to get excellence out of people in a business environment, as opposed to getting excellence out of people in a high performance sports team.
It's so funny you said that, because that was my transition out of bike racing into the real world. All of a sudden, I thought that's how you just achieve things, was just going all in. And it was 24/7, 365. And actually, I was like, that's not how you do it, is it? That's not very effective unless you're kind of, as Fran said, at this very pinnacle and on this passion-driven project. And I've been learning a lot of Francis regards that. How do you transfer that kind of this thing that you and I have experienced, and what gave us success in the past was that singular drive. and that kind of at times ruthlessness and selfishness, which is also quite a trait of elite athletes. But then actually transferring the good bits of that into, let me say, real world application is not easy. And it's something that Francis has been helping me with chapter 3, is kind of how do I kind of actually apply my core competencies into a business world. And it's not obvious. And it's been a very steep learning curve for me.
Yeah, you're very hard to live with, you elite athletes. Speaking as an everyday person that is not an elite athlete.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Trying to put you in an everyday regular context is not always straightforward.
No, it's fine.
But it's fine.
Walking apart.
So based on the fact that this pod is called Performance People, of which you are both exactly that, what do you think is sort of one nugget that you could give to everyday regular people from your lives of how to perform better every day? And I guess it's really interesting, David, off the back of what you've just said, but sort of a performance gain for somebody, a performance nugget for someone for every single day of their lives that they can do to perform better every day.
I'll go first because Francis will be much better than mine. As an athlete and as a pro cyclist, I was kind of taught, one of my strongest attributes was not giving up, and just don't give up, especially in the second half of my career, oddly, when I kind of came back with more humility. And I used to tell younger riders, it's like, don't give up. It's like, that's also what I guess they do say in an idealistic way regards young businesses is it's not companies that die, it's entrepreneurs that give up. But actually, I'm not so sure. I think it's choosing your fights and making sure you know when not to give up and when to give up. And give up has such negative connotations, so it might just be letting go rather than giving up. If there's something you love and that you believe in, don't give up. But if you don't love it, you might have to let it go. And so that's been probably my performance sort of tip and what I'm still trying to apply.
Fran?
That's a really good one, David.
No pressure.
My first reaction was going to be, I have learned, and more than anything else in my life from sort of Dave B, about, how do you get the best out of people? And I think my initial reaction was going to be the kind of, as much maligned and piss-takey as people are about marginal gains, there is something very, very powerful. And I believe fundamentally in, as a human being, thinking about how you can be a little bit better every day. You don't need to be exponentially better. You don't need to be 100% better. You just need to be a little bit better. And whether that's in managing your team or handling how you handle a phone call or how you deal with a meeting, you can improve all the time in tiny little areas, and those improvements will all add up. So that would probably be my initial response. But I also think that the big one here at Belstaff that I've kind of really, really used as a galvanizer is that when you're trying to perform at your very best, you need to be happy and you need to be enjoying it. And that finding a place where you get some joy out of the work. It's like I jokingly said earlier, I've never worked anywhere I don't love, but I think that's because I take a huge amount of satisfaction and joy from what I do. And that makes it easy to have the late nights. It makes it easier to do the long hours. It makes it easy to put in, because I absolutely love it. And I think if you can find a place, even if you don't love the job, be joyful in the environment you're in, or find people that you love working with, or find one bit of your day that gives you real pleasure, because that for me, joy is such a big part of success and performance. When you see athletes who are really happy and you've got everything going on and they've got, their family life sorted and they know exactly what their training plan is, and they're the guys that perform ultimately, because you fit all the pieces together and you get that. It's like locking in, finally, they might not be happy, but they've got everything sorted and they can focus on their task in hand. So yeah, I would say actually find some joy in it.
Fran, can I come and work for you? I want to go and work for Fran.
Yes.
It sounds like a really
Yes,
nice place to be.
You can come and work for me, Georgie, definitely.
Oh, thank you so much. That was the easiest job interview ever. Guys, thank you so much for speaking to us. I know it got a little bit Piers Morgan emotional in the middle there, but for very good reason, because it is a very, very emotive and evocative subject.
That's an incredible story.
Yeah. We're hugely privileged to be part of this conversation with you. So thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you two are in your happy places, which you obviously now are. So that's lovely to see. So thank you. And we hope to speak to you soon.
Thanks so much for asking us on as well, guys.
Thank you
really
both.
appreciate it. Thank you.
So How do you debrief that? I mean, very emotional.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to go at one point.
I was. I had to bring myself back from the edge. And that was really hard to listen to for obvious reasons. Probably mostly because they've never been in that environment together before. So to sort of have to do that, obviously brought back all those memories for them. But it was an incredibly interesting story for them to talk about and to tell in that way.
Yeah, and very emotional. I mean, David must take a huge amount of pride in where he's helped get the sport to, and Fran as well. And really interesting, that culture piece. Fran was talking about culture from high performance sport coming through to business and the success that she and her team are making out of Belstaff. So lots of great learnings.
Yeah, thank you for listening or watching today. We're Ben and Georgie Ainslie. This has been Performance People. And remember, from what we've learnt today, never give up.